public service and policy formation. This is one of the defining aspects of the Menzies government, is his attitude to the public service, keeping in place the so-called seven dwarves, the sort of really big public service heads that he inherited from the Chifley government, but as we'll hear through these papers, taking that sort of legacy that he inherited and then evolving it himself, particularly with this first paper by Jim Walter on the evolution of the Prime Minister's Department, which was quite radically sort of changed during the Menzies era. So it's great to have Jim here. You might know him as a guest on our Afternoon Light podcast, where he was a really fascinating guest, so we're sure in for a fascinating paper. Thanks.
Thanks, Zachary. I do have some slides, but they're not absolutely essential, and they don't appear to be coming up. There we are. They're really sort of my speaking notes, but they may give you a focus for your questions later. I talked about Menzies and Alan Brown, and it's partly because I have for a long time in my research been looking at the people behind the sort of prime ministers and decision makers. And I think Alan Brown is perhaps one of the most significant of these. And I very recently wrote the Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on Alan Brown, which really just skims the surface of what's there. If I was younger, I would start on another biography, but I feel like I'm a bit too old. I may not get to the end of it. But I think the first point I wanted to make is this point that Paul Hasluck made, that Menzies was mainly responsible for seeing that the Commonwealth Public Service was re-established after the war as an efficient, non-partisan and self-respecting institution. This was among his major achievements, according to Hasluck. And it was because of this that through the 50s and 60s, some of those great public servants, the seven dwarves among them, were able to make their own contributions to the way things developed. It was in fact a significant legacy of the Menzies period and the post-war Liberal Party. And it was achieved through a productive partnership between Menzies and Alan Brown, his departmental secretary, who I've suggested at first seemed to be an odd couple. Now, Brown is Secretary of Prime Ministers from 1949 to 1959, so in a formal sense, he's not part of this period that we're discussing today, the last years of the Menzies period. But I think the sort of regime that's established between Brown and Menzies is carried on because the successor secretaries, John Bunting and Geoffrey Yeend, were both, like Brown, products of the Department of Post-War Reconstruction. And that in effect carries right through to Geoff Yeend's retirement, which is in 1978. So it's a lengthy period. But back to this question, why were they an odd couple? Because Menzies, as David Kemp has shown, was the champion of liberalism, and David and others, particularly Judy Brett, have shown the sort of creative reformulation that Menzies achieved. in the 40s in reorganising the party and in expressing this philosophy of what the contemporary Liberal Party and liberalism might mean. But along comes Alan Brown. He was effectively the quintessential product of Nugget Coombs' Department of Post-War Reconstruction. He was very close to Coombs. Peter Lawler, who I did get to interview when he was very old, describes him in his own essays about Brown as Coombs' Vicar General, so close to Coombs that he was the Vicar General. Of course, it's a sort of metaphorical reference. And he'd been Coombs' deputy at the DPWR. He was appointed Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department when he was still quite young. And he was appointed by Chifley, and his aim was, or his brief was, to develop a directive policy-oriented central body, such as Coombs and Brown had envisaged. It seemed an odd link in that sense between this champion of liberalism turning to some extent, although we've heard much more detail about the dual economy and so on today, but to some extent turning against the sort of post-war Reconstruction Department's aim for this sort of planning regulatory body. Anyway, colleagues were not happy when he proposed accepting Brown and others, these key figures, but Menzies had a habit of meeting the key public servants when he was in opposition, meeting the key public servants as they went to and fro through King's Hall to go and see their own ministers. And he knew them. So he'd already developed relationships with all of these people, including Brown. And he satisfied himself that he could work with Brown. He asked Brown if he was a member of the Labor Party, and Brown said, I wouldn't be seen dead in the Labor Party, but I wouldn't be seen dead in your party either. And Menzies replied, well, that evened things up nicely. And so he kept on. And it became a friendship. In the notes and sort of marginal annotations on briefing, it's very clear that there's a friendship, and there's letters, references in the letters to my daughter, to Alan Brown. They're jokey. There's a real sense of this relationship. What were the background factors? Well, they might have had these philosophical differences, although I have to say it's hard to tell with Brown. He was a very proper, as his daughter said, when I talked to her. He was very proper. And he didn't talk about politics, he didn't talk about his work. So it's quite possible that he, despite being a disciple of Coombs, he was much more open to Menzies-style liberalism than perhaps appears. But the thing is, I think the common background is very important. They were both shaped by what Janet McCalman calls the Menzies heartland, the suburbs of Melbourne, where the forgotten people are located. They both attended Wesley College, where Lawrence Adamson instilled an ethic of civic duty, and they shared a particular idiom that derived from their experiences at Wesley and then at Melbourne University. Brown too studied in this room, despite the fact that it was a 17-year difference in their ages. They were both products of this context. Wesley College and the University of Melbourne Law School. They had a shared idiom. Menzies enjoyed the sort of caustic wit of, the lawyerly caustic wit that he could no longer sort of publicly use. But he and Brown would swap this in talking about, the people that they had to work with. They were complementary personalities in a way. Judy Brett has shown how Menzies invested himself in his private life, in his public life rather than his private life, the construction of a public figure. Brown was the opposite. He was intensely private. He wasn't sort of part of the Commonwealth Club set in particular. Some of his colleagues were unhappy about that because things were missed out because of the way the other key players would get together at the club, and Brown just didn't move in that circle. The friends came around to see him, people that he worked with, but they didn't talk politics or policy in front of the family. They sat out in the garden, according to his daughter. They'd have a cup of tea out in the garden. So he was the very opposite of what Dennis Grube calls a megaphone bureaucrat. Arthur Chang, for instance. He was the organisation man that Menzies needed. And Menzies respected what he still preferred to call the civil service. Brown was building a departmental structure that consolidated the department post-war Reconstruction experiment, but Menzies soon realised that it served his objectives. John Bunting has written very effectively about Menzies' boys and the trust and confidence that Menzies extended both to his staff and to the senior officials with whom he worked. And they became part of this inner circle, which few of his political colleagues had access to, perhaps because politicians might someday be his rivals. So at the end of the day, it was this inner circle that Menzies returned to explore ideas, to have a drink, and they're the ones who he invited around to the lodge on Sundays for meals. And it was Bunting who, in his memoir, called them Menzies boys. And Brown was chief among these, the Menzies boys. He was routinely included in significant diplomatic missions. He was once, in fact, sent on a familiarisation tour of Southeast Asia in Menzies' stead, standing in for Menzies. So what we see under Brown is a bureaucratic revolution. The department becomes the Prime Minister's eyes and ears in political circles. But a mark of that sort of affection is that among all these formal briefings and notes, there are letters and annotations about Menzies' personal well-being. At one stage, he tells Menzies, who's about to go to a Commonwealth conference, you shouldn't go. You've not been well, you're weak, you're picking up every wog that's going. I reckon we should, the doctors, you should get the doctors to say, are you well enough to go? There are other colleagues of yours, cabinet ministers, who can do the job. So he was not just giving a departmental view, he was saying, look after yourself, and trying to sort of alert him to that. Menzies, of course, ignored the advice and went anyway, but that sort of thing is very evident. Anyway, the point is that the department is revitalised, just in the way that Coombs had envisaged, to become a more activist and policy-oriented department than the sort of administrative postbox that Pat Weller describes as having preceded Brown's tenure. Menzies accepted Brown's insistence that PMD should be an independent source of advice to the Prime Minister with policy capacities traversing all departments, and that allowed a fundamental redirection of the department. Now, of course, not everything went smoothly. Brown, in the department itself, was very highly regarded. He evoked intense loyalty. He used to make the tea for his colleagues, bring in cakes, this sort of thing. A sort of humble demeanour. But of course, he was dealing with the others, the other big players. Fred Wheeler at the Public Service Board, at the Public Service Board, and particularly Roland Wilson at Treasury, who were always in contest in a sense. Now, Brown won out for the department because he had the Prime Minister's ear and his support, but he was also the level-headed advisor who helped to manage the policy battles between those big egos. Wilson at Treasury, John McEwen and Jack Crawford, about whom we'll hear later, at Trade, and Coombs, now at the Reserve Bank, but often in intense conflict with particularly Roland Wilson. And Brown is a mediator. He helps to manage those relationships, which becomes very important, of course. So what I'm moving towards is this idea of a sort of marriage of liberal creativity and bureaucratic innovation. Bunting was later credited with having bedded down Brown's vision, and he serves for a longer period. Brown says only 10 years because he thinks that he's done all he can. Bunting takes it up, but he says, "Nothing happened except by way of due process. I did no more than pick it up from my predecessor, Alan Brown." And the line of succession, as I've mentioned, resumes when Geoff Yeend, who'd been an executive assistant to Brown in 1949 and a private secretary to Menzies in 1954, was appointed Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, as it then was, in 1978. Pat Weller, I think, characterises what they had set up quite well as a system focused on the cerebral questioning of the policy proposals of others. And it was this sort of, getting people to justify what they were doing, to explain what they were doing, and to sort of settle the big egos that were in conflict, that I think was very important. Arguably, the changing demands of the 70s and 80s led to the abandonment of this sort of Brown, Bunting, Yeend regime in favour of a much more can-do policy implementation approach. But that too depended on the centrality of the Prime Minister's department that Brown had established. That centrality of what is now Prime Minister and Cabinet has remained and has been amplified in the years since. when Alan Davies, writing in 1986, the year Yean resigned from PM&C, looked back on the post-war phenomenon, he celebrated a high level of bureaucratic innovation and a pattern of resort to bureaucratic initiative when parties were deadlocked or had run out of ideas. That's basically the gist of the thing, but I've got some unintended consequences and some questions that people might have responses to, people who are here today, that I would very much like to get feedback on. Sol Ensel, I think, writing one of the best books on the post-war, in what he called the intensification of bureaucracy, warned us to go back to Max Weber's essay Bureaucracy in 1911, that argued that bureaucratic organisation is the inevitable accompaniment of modernity, but that the authority delegated to officials and politicians may conflict with the equality and individual liberty promised by democracy. Malcolm Fraser, when I talked to him only a year before he died, spoke of having good relations with his senior officials, but told me as I left, we need to talk about the public service. When you've got generational continuity of public servants, as happened since the war, it can become a problem. I was going to go back and ask him about how he saw the problem, but that unfortunately didn't arise before he soon after died. And of course that point is the crux of Michael Young's famous satirical takedown of the rise of meritocracy in 1958. And you'll know that there is a vigorous debate now, these days, about the so-called meritocracy trap, which feeds into populist ideas of the deep state and so on. Public policy analysts and public service reviews, in my view, from the Royal Commission on Australian Government Administration in 1974 right through to the David Thodey review in 2019, have been aware of this problem of the bureaucrats and the meritocrats developing a sort of a culture and a context and a system that removes them from understanding the things that confront people in their everyday lives, particularly because they're off in Canberra. And they've tried, including this latest review, to say, how do we overcome this problem? But as Max Weber argued a century ago, we have to remain continually alert. And we'd have to, in the current context, ask, is the contemporary decline of trust in politicians and public servants a red flag that we should be looking closely at? Thank you.
Coombs was very interesting, and I don't know whether you've read the. Can you hear me? Read the letter that Menzies wrote to Coombs when Coombs retired as governor of the Reserve Bank. It's an incredible letter. Coombs reproduced it in full in his autobiography. Yes. And the letter starts, Menzies saying, you know, when we came back to government, many of my colleagues wanted me to get rid of you. Yeah. And I said, no, we keep him on. If he proves to be loyal and supportive, he will continue. And Menzies went on to say, it was not just our working relationship that I greatly treasured, but our personal relationship. No other personal relationship gave me greater satisfaction. And it's an incredible letter, and I think it says a lot about Menzies' personal relationships with people, you know, like Coombs, who was clearly of the left, but they got on extremely well. And I remember reading Coombs, Menzies saying about Chipley. He said on one occasion that there wouldn't be an occasion on a big issue that I wouldn't first consult Ben. So it comes through time and time again. Yep.
Yeah, no, I have read the letter in the Coombs autobiography, and I think that's true. There was a quote that was in the slides that I didn't read, but William Heseltine also made this comment that Menzies was a sort of rather shy and aloof man, but generated this intense affection with everyone who worked with him. And I think that's a sort of theme too that comes through in other things. But I agree that those letters, like the sort of exchanges between Brown and Menzies, you know, are indicative of that sort of build-up of relationships that I don't think you see typically with other Prime Ministers and their departmental subordinates.
Linda?
In terms of your point about authority delegated to officials, what's your view of the current situation with the public service, particularly in respect to digital first style policies? Are today's public servants more in touch or less in touch than the bureaucrats of Menzies' time with the people?
Look, I think that's a good question, and it's very. There's a couple of things I'd say. One is that I worked very closely with Glenn Davis in the past. In fact, at one stage I was his line manager for reasons I won't go into. But we never really had to have meetings about how he was performing. But the thing that I was expecting and hoping for when he became the current secretary of the department was that he was a man who was both deeply engaged with all the sort of public policy literature and theory and so on, but also one who had talked in his own work about inclusivity and being able to, you know, draw people in to policy deliberations and particularly people who'd been who are going to be affected by it. So I held out some hopes that would lead to change. There was an essay in the monthly review, I think the last monthly review about Glenn Davis, where some of these things were discussed. But we're too close now to the action. You can't sort of talk to people or in the way you can once they're retired or they're moved on. And I think that the evidence in front of us is that there is just too much going on for them to do that sort of deliberative, what some call deliberative bureaucracy. There seem to be challenges coming from all sides that they feel are so urgent that they're not able to establish those sorts of relationships. So I think, that would be my reading at present. I'd be very happy to see that I'm wrong, but it is a difficult sort of situation.
Just very quickly, this will be your last question.
One of the issues that you haven't touched upon, which I think is probably really important, is the character of these men. The earlier senior public servants were men of political neutrality. Well, Dr. Coombs is an excellent example. I used to work at the Reserve Bank. But with the exception of a few people like Dennis Richardson, it seems that the leaders of the modern public service are far more politically astute than their predecessors, or allowing their political persuasions to influence their judgments a lot more. Is that a reasonable thought?
I'm not. I mean, in terms of, as I said about Brown, it's very hard to pick what he was a disciple of Coombs, but when he worked for Menzies, he was very careful not to talk about his sort of political opinions, even in the family. But I think there's another question. When I interviewed Peter Shergold about his time working with Howard, he said, well, of course, he'd been recruited by Hawke. He'd been brought in to work in multiculturalism. He'd been, for a time, the director of the ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. You would have thought, he was a Labor man in a sense. He works very effectively with Howard. And when I asked him about this, he said, well, one doesn't always agree. But firstly, a government is entitled to get a support for what they have put to the people. And that has to be the public servant's guiding principle. Secondly, you can go to the Prime Minister and say, look, I think this is wrong, you should be doing this. And you can perhaps do that 2 times. But the 3rd time, you'd have to say, so what am I going to do? Will I resign? Or is staying here going to be a more effective way of getting some sorts of incremental change? And Shergold then goes on after his period to do a very sort of effective job of working with the people who are affected by policy as the Commissioner for Refugee Resettlement in New South Wales, where he actually set up what you might call deliberative bureaucracy by working directly with those people under a Liberal Premier, and with their support. So they can do things, but I think they might be politically astute, but I think on the whole they don't come with a political agenda. And Shergold, I think, is a great example of one who, again, you might have said was an odd couple when he was first appointed by Howard, but proved to be very effective in supporting most of what Howard wanted done.
Thanks, Jim.